Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. You could see from the video that what I do is I talk a lot. Wherever I am, I'm talking. So not very exciting maybe, but I hope I can help you in this wonderful, wonderful initiative, Prophetic Economy. Boy, when I got the invitation to come to the Prophetic Economy Conference, I said, of course, yes. What could be more exciting and visionary and inspirational and important? And I've never been to a conference in 40 years of being an economist with this title before, so I'm very, very excited. This is really an important idea. And thank you for all the young people here, because everything I'm going to tell you is your homework. Because you're going to be the ones making the better future. And I'm going to hope I give some ideas of what we need to do and what we can do right now. Well, I'm going to start with the prophet, with Isaiah, because that sets the standard for prophecy. And what Isaiah said is very, very important for us. So I'll just read a little bit of Isaiah 2. That in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths." The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. This is also the inscription just outside the United Nations. To beat the swords into plowshares and the spears into pruning hooks. It is our biggest challenge, ladies and gentlemen. The vision is our greatest guide. The biggest enemy of all that we want is war, and the spirit of hate, or the motivation of hate that gets us to destroy rather than to build. We really need pruning hooks. We don't need the spears. And we really need the way to find this path towards peace. And that, I think, is why we're here. Let me refer to another prophet, Micah, who gives us a good definition of what we should do. Because he says that he, the Lord, has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. This is a good working guide for us. It's not a list of 83 things to do. It's 3 big ones. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. One of the great and inspiring visionary leaders in my lifetime was President John F. Kennedy, the president that I love above all of our other presidents of modern history. And President Kennedy said something very important in his inaugural address as president about a half a century ago. And it really defines, in my view, our modern era. It encapsulates in one idea what it means for us in our time. President Kennedy said in his inaugural address, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." That is our existential reality. That is the meaning of modernity. We have in our hands the technologies, the know-how, the science, the communications to abolish poverty. We also have, at the same time, through the same technological know-how, the horrible reality of the power to destroy all forms of human life. And one can add millions of other species as well. When President Kennedy uttered these words, he was speaking about the imminent dangers of nuclear war. Those dangers are not past. We have been lucky to survive. We have a very unstable president of the United States, a very dangerous man. That's not a good idea for presidents. And he announced last week that he intends for the United States to withdraw from the Intermediate Force Nuclear Framework Treaty. That's a very bad idea. We should not be withdrawing from any nuclear treaties. We should be building and fulfilling our treaties. So the nuclear crisis is not over. It remains one of our great challenges. The Nobel Peace Prize went to the international network to abolish nuclear weapons. This is something we must all be active in. But what President Kennedy could not have known in 1961 is that we have the power to abolish life in another means as well, and that is environmental catastrophe. Because now we're on a planet that has twice the number of people as when President Kennedy spoke, and the economy has grown many times since then, and with it has come an unprecedented environmental crisis, even already a catastrophe that's underway. Humanity is now burning so much coal, oil, and natural gas that we are changing the climate, causing global warming. We're creating so much pollution that the oceans are polluted with our plastics, and the soils and waterways are polluted with our pesticides and our nitrogen fluxes and our phosphorus from fertilizers and from many, many other industrial processes. And we are converting so much land from forests and grasslands and wetlands into croplands and pasture lands that we're destroying the habitat of millions of other species. This is unprecedented. And so we face another crisis of the kind that President Kennedy described a half century ago. We are literally destroying the basis for our survival, our well-being, and the very survival of millions of other species. So our challenge in our generation is sustainable development. I see track change converted piece to piece. I hear that's meant to say P-E-A-C-E, or maybe I did in the wee hours of the morning. But our challenge of sustainable development is to abolish poverty, to meet human needs, to end the violence of social exclusion when people can't participate because they're girls and women, because they're minority groups, because they're refugees, and they're kept outside of society. We need to preserve the peace, P-E-A-C-E, and we need to protect the planet. This is our generation's challenge. It's uniquely our generation's challenge because every earlier generation had the challenges to fight poverty and to preserve peace. But in our generation, we face the existential reality that President Kennedy referred to. We can end poverty. It is our moral, our ethical commandment to do so. And we must preserve the peace because we have no room for failure. And we are the generation that has to solve the environmental crisis because we are out of time. Because if we waste another generation, we will destroy climate safety, we will not only threaten, but drive to extinction millions of other species. We will destabilize the food supplies. It's on us now to solve the environmental crisis. Pope Francis is the world's leading hope for moral leadership, our greatest moral leader. And he made a statement in his encyclical in 2015, Laudato Si, that is the most powerful moral call to action for the whole world that we have. And Pope Francis emphasized that his encyclical Laudato Si is not a call to the Catholic faithful, it's to the whole world. It's to open a dialogue with the entire world, peoples of all religions, all faiths, non-believers, the entire world. Because one of the most important things that Pope Francis says in Laudato Si is that interdependence, that means how we're all interconnected worldwide, obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. We need a worldwide effort to face the ecological and the social exclusion. We're a rich world. We are a technologically advanced world. We're a scientifically sophisticated world. But the world economy does not produce justice. It does not ensure social inclusion. And it certainly does not protect the creation, the natural environment. Therefore, we can't depend on market forces or what economists call the invisible hand to protect us, to save us from ourselves. For that, we need a moral commitment. We need a diplomatic framework. We need a common plan for the world. On September 25th, 2015, 3 years ago, at the opening of the United Nations General Assembly, Pope Francis spoke to the world leaders. He told them of their moral responsibility. He told them of the ultimate stakes that were involved. And at the end of his speech to the world leaders, the 193 governments of the United Nations adopted a common framework called Agenda 2030. And Agenda 2030 includes 17 sustainable development goals, the ones that are shown here. These are the agreed goals for the entire world community, the closest thing we have to a common plan for our common home. They call on the world to end extreme poverty, to end hunger, to ensure access to health care for every person on the planet, to ensure that every child, like the beautiful kids with us today, can get a good education, no matter if they're born in the poorest places of the world, no matter if they find themselves among the tens of millions of refugees and displaced people in the world today, that every child should have access. SDG 5 calls for gender equality. SDG 6 for clean water and sanitation for all. SDG 7 for a requirement of modern life, access to modern energy services, including electricity from renewable energy. SDG 8, decent work for all, so that people through their vocation can find a full life, a topic we discussed at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Social Sciences this week. SDG 9, on modern infrastructure for all. SDG 10, to reduce inequalities of income, because the gaps between the super rich and the desperately poor have reached proportions that are mind-boggling. Mr. Bezos, Jeffrey Bezos, the owner of Amazon, creator of Amazon, has today a personal net worth, not a company net worth, but a personal net worth of about $130 billion. Not bad. If he uses it right to help the people who have almost nothing, who are struggling for survival. And there are today 2,208 billionaires in the world whose combined worth is about $10 trillion. And so a small part of their wealth each year could provide the funding for the schools, the health care, and the other needs of the world's poorest people. That's SDG 10. SDG 11 says that our cities, where more than half the world's people live, should be sustainable, healthy, happy, vibrant cities. I would say like Italy's magnificent cities. We travel all over the world, but never happier than being here. SDG 12 calls for responsible consumption and production. About a third of all the food grown in the world is lost to waste, either at the time of the harvest or what we throw out in our kitchens of food that has gone bad or hasn't been consumed. SDG 13 says, live up to the commitments of the Paris Climate Agreement. Stop the dangerous global warming. Convert from coal, oil, and gas to wind and solar and hydro and other zero-carbon energy sources. Walk, bicycle, ride public transport, or ride in electric vehicles. This is the future that we need. SDG 14 is to protect the oceans and the marine ecosystems. And SDG 15 is to protect the land or the terrestrial ecosystems. SDG 16 calls for peace and the rule of law. and to stop the brazen corruption that is in my country out of control. In the United States, billions of dollars will have been given this election to politicians for their campaigns. Who do you think calls the shots in the United States? Billionaires. That's how come we have such a disastrous government right now. Because money speaks, not the people. So we need to reestablish the rule of law, not the rule of money. Jesus said something about that, by the way, very wisely when he overturned the tables of the moneylenders in the temple. And we need to do the same in the capital of the United States and in other centers of power in the world. And SDG 17 calls for partnership. Partnership so that we work on these goals together. So what is required to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? I will refer to one of my favorite guides. I like both of these gentlemen. You'll recognize Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. I almost always like to visit them in the School of Athens when we're at the Vatican. Plato is pointing up to the heavens to his ideal form, and Aristotle is carrying my favorite book, the Nicomachean Ethics, his wonderful book to his son Nicomachus on how to live a good life. So I want to say a few words about these gentlemen, and especially about Aristotle, who, for me, teaches a lot about the good life. And you'll recall that he defines in Greek the good life as eudaimonia. And we need to find eudaimonia in our time. It's sometimes translated into English as well-being, or maybe even better as flourishing or thriving. And so what do we know about that kind of well-being? Well, first, Aristotle pointed out there are different kinds of knowledge that we need. And I want all of the young people to build their knowledge. And I want to point out the kinds of knowledge that we need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Aristotle talked about three kinds of knowledge that are very important for us. One is episteme. That is science. And for the Greeks to learn episteme, they went to a place called Panepistemios, which is in Latin, the university. So to go to the Panepistemios to gain epistemic knowledge is very important. There's also techne, or technical knowledge, the know-how. So what the episteme tells us is that humanity is warming the planet. It's creating dangerous climate change. That's what the climate scientists tell us. The technologists can tell us how to solve that problem. The engineers have the technique. They can tell us, here's how a solar panel can work. Here is how we can convert from coal to sunshine to power the world. And then a third kind of knowledge that Aristotle talked about is phronesis, which in the Greek means practical wisdom. To know what's important, what should we work on, how should we solve the problems in particular places. Phronesis today means how to address sustainable development in each part of the world, in each city, in each village. How can we find the solutions? That's what you are doing at the Prophetic Economy Conference of 2018. Well, both Plato and Aristotle also had some good advice for us. How do you achieve the right kind of knowledge? That doesn't come so easily. You have to work hard at it. What they said is that we need to cultivate the human virtues. What does that mean? It means we're not just born with the epistemic knowledge or the techne or the phronesis. We have to work hard at it. We have to find people who can help to mentor us, to teach us. We have to get in the habit of good behavior. We have to do good deeds. And we have to pursue what the Greeks call the virtues, arete. And of course, the cardinal virtues that were propounded by Plato and Aristotle and by Thomas Aquinas and the church include prudence, the ability to judge well, justice, to give each person what they're due, including the poor what they need, fortitude, the bravery to fight for what you need to do, to go out and fight for it. It's not always easy. And temperance, which the Greek said is the inner calm, so that you have the repose you need to be able to make these wise decisions. Now, that is the kind of wisdom we need, and we find great wisdom in the church and in the social teachings of the church. I've referred to Laudato Si already as the most important message to the world about the environmental and social crisis. Let me refer to another great message of Pope Paul VI in one of the greatest encyclicals of modern times, Populorum Progressio, the progress of the peoples, a half century ago. He says something very important, absolutely relevant for us, and it refers back to Isaiah. He says a further step must be taken. When we were at Bombay for the Eucharistic Congress, that's a half century ago, we asked world leaders to set aside part of their military expenditures for a world fund to relieve the needs of impoverished people. What is true for the immediate war against poverty is also true for the work of national development. Only a concerted effort on the part of all nations, embodied in and carried out by this World Fund, will stop these senseless rivalries and promote fruitful, friendly dialogue between nations. What a wonderful idea. I like to call this the Isaiah Fund. If we can get the world leaders to put the money that they're wasting in armaments into fighting poverty, how much we could accomplish. The world's governments are going to waste almost $2 trillion this year on paying for the military. But if that money were used for peaceful purposes, we would end poverty, end hunger, get every child in school, and get everybody access to health care, safe water, sanitation, electrification, renewable energy. That's all we need to do, to shift from war to peace. Isaiah told us this already, more than 2 millennia ago, and Pope Paul VI told us a half a century ago. We're also starting a new movement that I would like you to become part of, called Move Humanity. It is similarly a call on the world's billionaires. You must do your part. You can't just buy big yachts, big mansions, fly to Mars, or whatever you think about. You have to solve problems on Earth, and specifically the Sustainable Development Goals. So Move Humanity is a new movement being launched now that calls on mobilizing at least 1% per year of the net worth of the world's richest people. It doesn't sound like much, and they'd hardly notice. They wouldn't notice at all, except they'd feel better by contributing to global problem solving. But let me tell you how much that is. Since the world's billionaires, as I noted, have $10 trillion of net worth, 1% of that is $100 billion a year. Oh my God. That's enough to provide a place in school and access to primary health care for every child on this planet from just 2,208 people. So please join. If you happen to live next door to a billionaire, knock on his door.
I'm not
Or if you happen to know one, tell him Professor Sachs is going to reach him. Because we're serious. It's time to end all forms of human poverty so that we avoid the disasters that otherwise will befall us. Let me close finally with wise words of President John F. Kennedy as I started. Because not only did he define this real meaning of our time, but he lived through and helped us to find a way out of one of the most terrifying moments of human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world almost to nuclear war. And at the end of that crisis, he and his counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, and Pope John the 23rd, said we must move to peace decisively. In the spring of 1963, Pope John the 23rd, though he was dying of cancer, said he would use every measure of his remaining strength to help make a way to peace. And he issued a magnificent encyclical called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, telling governments you must behave according to a moral framework. And this compelling message helped President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev find the way to a treaty. President Kennedy spoke in June 1963, calling on Americans to reconsider their attitudes towards peace. Because he said, all the world wants peace, so we should never believe that our counterpart is not human or doesn't want peace. We should always struggle to find a way to peace. And Nikita Khrushchev heard that speech and said, I want to make peace with that man. And they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in Moscow in July 1963. And in speaking about peace, President Kennedy said something very, very important. Why it's possible to find peace for the world. And I just want to end with these words. He said, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal. Thank you very much.